Sharon, stay. Welcome. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jonathan Alter. I'm chair of the board of the J. Anthony Lucas Prize Project. And as I think many of you know, the Lucas and Lynton prizes, the Lynton History Prize, Mark Lynton History Prize, and the J. Anthony Lucas Prize and the Work in Progress prizes are administered jointly by Columbia Journalism School and the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. And I want to introduce our host for this evening. That's Anne-Marie Lipinski, Pulitzer Prize winning former editor of the Chicago Tribune and the curator of the Nieman Foundation. We've got a good and very stimulating evening ahead. So Anne-Marie.
We're killing the music.
That might have done it.
That's it. It's not.
Sorry, folks. That jazz.
It's called the Jazz Lounge Bar, in case anyone's interested. Thank you, Jonathan, and welcome everyone to the presentation of the J. Anthony Lucas Prize Project Awards, honoring the very best of American nonfiction book writing. In celebrating our gifted winners this evening, we remember Pulitzer Prize winning journalist J. Anthony Lucas, a 1969 Nieman Fellow, and the late Mark Lynton, a history enthusiast, an expert and senior executive at the firm Hunter Douglas in the Netherlands. Lynton's wife, Marion, and children Lily and Michael established the Mark Lynton History Prize and have generously supported and sponsored the Lucas Prize Project since its creation. Tony, as his friends knew him, began the career that would distinguish him as one of the country's master storytellers while an undergraduate reporter at the Harvard Crimson. He would go on to win 2 Pulitzer Prizes, the first in 1968 for his reporting at the New York Times, the second for Common Ground, a turbulent decade in the lives of 3 American families, his landmark work about school desegregation and busing in Boston. The work is an American masterpiece. One of Lucas's great gifts was his ability to pair the common with the combustible. There was always a fine tension running beneath the most mundane moments in the book, a writing style that must well characterize the social climate in Boston during this tumultuous period. Tony published 5 important books, each an examination of a critical rift in America's social and political landscape, each seen through the lens of individuals caught up in the tides of change. To do this, he brought an intense focus to methodology. During the reporting for Common Ground, he abandoned one family midway through the 7-year project to focus on another family because his first choice, he said, was not working dramatically. He was absolutely brilliant, said David Halberstam. He took journalism to a high intellectual level, yet he also had the doggedness of an old-fashioned police reporter. Colin Diver, a subject of Common Ground, said, in the excruciating, almost obsessive precision of his research, he reminded us of the cleansing power of truth. In his relish for the richness of his material, he taught us there can be a richness, even a kind of nobility, in the ordinariness of everyday life. The year following his death in 1997, his widow, Linda Healy, joined with friends and colleagues to honor his memory by creating the Lucas Prize Project, which is what brings us together this evening. Thank you so much to the judges of these awards who worked so hard to select tonight's amazing winners among hundreds of entries. Some of the judges are with us here. Please stand when I say your name. Jessica Bruder, Van Newkirk, Shireen Meraji, Alia Malik, Elizabeth Taylor, William Thomas, and Deidre Mask. Some of our distinguished judges are also past honorees of this prize. Thank you also to the amazing Lukas board, and welcome to those members who are here: Lily Lynton, Shay Earhart, Pamela Paul, Annette Gordon-Reed, Sam Friedman, Abby Wright, and of course our chair, Jonathan Alter. And to the Lynton family, thank you for your generous support and for making these awards possible. We are also grateful for your backing of grants for two of the students in Sam Friedman's very famous book writing course. We have some of the students from Sam's class with us, and we welcome you all here tonight. I would now invite our newest board member, Jelani Cobb, to join me for the presentation of the awards. He is the recently named Dean of the Columbia Journalism School and the Henry Luce Professor of Journalism. Dean Cobb is also a staff writer for The New Yorker and the author of several books, including The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama, and The Paradox of Progress. So next up, the awards. We first present the J. Anthony Lukas Book Prize, given to a book-length work of narrative nonfiction on a topic of American social or political concern that exemplifies the literary grace, commitment to serious research, and original reporting that characterize the distinguished work of the award's namesake. The prize carries a $10,000 honorarium. This year's judges were Jessica Bruder, Emily Bazelon, Shireen Marisol Meraji, and Van Newkirk. This year's winner is author and journalist Linda Villarosa for her book Under the Skin: The Hidden Toll of Racism on American Lives and on the Health of Our Nation. Linda is a professor at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY with a joint appointment at the City College of New York, as well as a contributing writer at the Times Magazine, where she covers the intersection of race and health. The judge's citation reads, "Under the Skin is a poignant, deeply reported investigation of the racial inequalities underlying the U.S. medical system. Leveraging decades of experience as a health journalist, Linda probes some of the darkest disparities, gaps in average life expectancy and the quality of care afforded Black and white Americans. She builds her argument on a scaffold of rigorous and sometimes shocking research, and while painting vivid scenes behind the statistics. The Section 8 apartment of the Relf sisters, who were involuntarily sterilized as children at a federally funded clinic in Alabama. The Louisiana labor and delivery room, where an underpaid doula demands dignity for her callously mistreated Black client. The Colorado Veterans Hospital, where Linda, horrified, finds her own critically ill father, now thin, disheveled, in leg restraints, and must lobby his caregivers for his dignity. Through it all, she is a skilled, steady, and even generous guide, recounting her own awakening to the outcomes of systematic bias and inviting readers to join her on the other side of that journey. Under the Skin is elegantly written, revelatory, and given the crisis of Black maternal and infant mortality, utterly necessary. Please join me in congratulating Linda. This year's finalist for the J. Anthony Lukas Book Prize is His Name is George Floyd: One Man's Life and the Struggle for Racial Justice, by Robert Samuels and Toluse Olorunnipa. Samuels became a staff writer at The New Yorker in March 2023, focusing on politics, policy, and the changing American identity. He wrote His Name is George Floyd during his tenure as a national political reporter for The Washington Post, where he worked for 12 years. Prior to the Post, he worked at the Miami Herald. Tolu is the White House bureau chief for the Post. He joined the paper in 2019 and has covered 3 presidencies. He previously worked at Bloomberg, where he reported on politics and policy from Washington and Florida. The judges write in their citation that when Minneapolis police killed George Floyd in 2020, it sparked an American reckoning and, in the public eye, reduced a man's life to 9 minutes and 29 seconds. His Name is George Floyd fills in the 46 years that came before, restoring to Floyd's story the complexity that he was denied in death. Building on reporting from the Washington Post, Robert and Toluse offer a definitive account of Floyd's life. They follow his journey from the hospital in Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he was born, to the housing projects in Houston's 3rd Ward, where he was raised, to the Minneapolis suburb of St. Louis Park, where he sought a fresh start. The authors share historical and contemporary context that reveals how American racism contoured Floyd's experience long before it contributed to his end. Their account reads with the propulsive quality of a novel, depicting a man who, despite his flaws, was deeply beloved and optimistic, who dreamed of changing the world until, in the most devastating way, he succeeded. Please join me in congratulating Robert and Toluse. The Mark Lynton History Prize is awarded annually to a work of history on any subject that best combines intellectual distinction with felicity of expression and carries a $10,000 honorarium. This year's judges were Elizabeth Taylor, Deidre Mask, and William G. Thomas. This year's winner is author Deborah Cohen for Last Call at the Hotel Imperial, the reporters who took on a world at war. Deborah is the Richard W. Leopold Professor of History at Northwestern University. Her previous books include The War Come Home, Disabled Veterans in Britain and Germany, and Family Secrets, Shame and Privacy in Modern Britain. She writes for The Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, and the Wall Street Journal. The judge's citation reads, Cohen's brilliant ensemble drama features American newspaper correspondents John Gunther, Dorothy Thompson, Vincent Jimmy Sheehan, and H.R. Knickerbocker, as each arrives in Europe after World War I and chases stories that lead readers at home to reimagine their place in a changing world. Perceptive and unabashedly inquisitive, Cohen has written not only a rich cultural history, but a commanding and inspiring account of war and politics in the 1930s. As they witnessed the rise of fascism and debated communism, these reporters shared a conviction that the idea of journalistic objectivity should be set aside. Truth was more important, as Sheehan put it, than, quote, a litany of facts. They wrote what they felt and thought about the world in crisis. Cohen's extraordinary narrative combines distinctive literary style and deep archival revelations to illuminate the personal as political. She captures these writers as passionate idealists facing a world in crisis, their messy lives caught in a swirl of infidelity and loyalty, love and rivalry, pride and loss. Last Call is to be savored like a dry martini at Vienna's Hotel Imperial bar. And if I could just add one other thing, Lily Lynton said, my dad would have loved this book. Please join me in congratulating Deborah. This year's finalist for the Mark Lynton History Prize is Kelly Lytle Hernandez for Bad Mexicans, Race, Empire, and Revolution in the Borderlands. Kelly holds the Thomas E. Lifka Endowed Chair in History and directs the Center for African American Studies at UCLA. The judge's citation says, in her vivid history, Kelly reframes the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico and argues that the Mexican Revolution not only transformed Central America, but also shaped the U.S. in ways that endure to this day. She has rendered a polyphonic account that entwines the rise of U.S. imperialism, the making of the American West, and the establishment of the global color line, deeply researched and interwoven with archival sources held by allies and descendants of the revolutionaries. Her masterful narrative emphasizes the importance of the Mexican rebels, led by radical Ricardo Flores Magón, whose grassroots movement of Magonistas opposed the regime of authoritarian President Porfirio Diaz. Forced to flee across the border, the Magonistas staged revolutionary movements across Mexico from their temporary bases in the U.S., only to be pursued in turn by the U.S. Department of Justice, intent on propping up the Diaz regime. Her revelatory and stunning account tells us how the Mexican Revolution, which forced more than 1 million Mexicans to flee, remade the United States and resonated beyond the U.S.-Mexico border. Please join us in congratulating Kelly. She can't be with us tonight, but we congratulate her from afar. And now to the 2 J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Awards. These awards in the amount of $25,000 each are given annually to aid in the completion of significant works of nonfiction on a topic of American political or social concern. This year's judges were Paul Golub, Alia Malik, and Paige Williams. Jesselyn Cook wins one of the Work in Progress Awards for The Quiet Damage, QAnon and the Destruction of the American Family. She is an Atlanta area journalist whose reporting focuses on online dangers, including weaponized conspiracy theories and other disinformation. Prior to working as an investigative reporter at NBC News, she was a senior reporter on the National Enterprise Desk at HuffPost and an adjunct journalism professor at the University of La Verne. The citation reads, "The Quiet Damage is a harrowing exploration of the harm the far-right conspiracy theory movement QAnon has wrought on U.S. society, specifically at its most basic and intimate level, the family. QAnon, situated within the dangerous cross-currents of disinformation, partisan dysfunction, and identity politics, has often been dismissed by most Americans as a fringe movement, but its potential to wreak havoc was clearly underestimated. Her narrative reveals how seemingly ludicrous beliefs take hold of people who are easily recognizable to any reader, even as they become unrecognizable to their loved ones. Her empathic portrait of real families shattered by QAnon viscerally conveys the depth of their loss and devastation, as well as the urgency with which we must confront this phenomenon. Congratulations to Jesselyn. And our last award and the second work in progress goes to Mike Hixenbaugh for Uncivil, One Town's Fight Over Race and Identity and the New Battle for America's Schools. Mike is a senior investigative reporter for NBC News. He's worked at newspapers in Ohio, North Carolina, Virginia, Texas, where his reporting uncovered deadly failures in the U.S. military, abuses in the child welfare system, and safety lapses at major hospitals. He has been a Pulitzer finalist and winner of the Peabody Award. The citation reads, "The fraught issue of race in America's schools is the focus of Mike's immersive and urgent reporting in Uncivil, in which he describes how and why the suburbs have been consumed by toxic political and cultural battles that threaten to undermine the system of public education in this country. The school district in Southlake, Texas, seemed to offer everything that parents would want for their children: small classes, dedicated teachers, financial resources, a track record of academic success, and school spirit in abundance. After a series of troubling incidents became public and a program to promote racial understanding was proposed, the atmosphere curdled and tore the community apart." He recounts these events through the perspective of students, parents, teachers, and others whose lives and assumptions were upended, ultimately illuminating a coordinated, well-funded, escalating effort by conservative extremists to preserve their power and dominance. Congratulations to Mike. Over to you, Dean Cobb.
Hold on.
So good evening to all of you. Wow, really? It was like, tough crowd. Let's just go get drinks. Let's get out of here. So I have the good fortune of being the moderator for this discussion. I was told that I should really lean in and ask tough questions like, do you know how great you are? Do you often reflect upon your own greatness? I think we'll find like a kind of middle ground here, but we're really excited to have you all here and to be able to host you for this discussion. So I'll start with Linda, whose work I've actually known the longest of anyone here. And so you've studied health disparities for years. And in the book, you describe how your thinking has changed over time about the root causes of the disparities. Can you take us through a little bit about the evolution of your thinking and the parallel path of you working on this book?
Well, first, thank you. I'm so honored to be here and want to say that Common Ground is foundational for me, a foundational piece of work. Well, I started as an editor at Essence magazine. I was the health editor in the late 80s. I was very young. And my whole goal was to, if every individual person that's reading this magazine does what we're telling them to do, in fact, take care of yourself, take good care of yourself, then the whole race will become healthier. And then little by little, I began to see that pushing individuals to do better and be better, while is good for individuals, will not change the health outcomes of Black people in America as a whole because of structural issues that I was not examining. And it took me a while. I'm really, really slow. Good luck to you writing your books. To figure out that, wait, this advice I'm giving is not really helping to solve my own goal, which is to make Black people as a whole better. And also some personal experiences that I had where I saw that the health system that I'm even telling people to believe in isn't even working for people that I know and love. And so by the end of my journey and the book, I'm a completely different thinker.
I wonder, Deborah, if I could follow up with you. And, I've heard tell that journalists are a gossipy sort. I would never have. I'll tell you about how I know that later afterward. And I will, as an aside, I will tell you this, that Pulitzer Hall is the least discreet building on all of Columbia's campus. Like, literally, there is no room in this building where you can say something that you don't want the entire building to know. And I'm convinced that that is intentional. But in any case, the world that you describe is very much defined by the interaction of these journalists and the context in which it happened. How essential was that to their work? And how much of a part of what they were doing, was that community that you describe?
So first of all, I just wanted to say, can everyone hear me in the back? I just wanted to say, again, what a huge honor it is to be here, and thank you so much. So the group of journalists who were at the heart of Last Call were friends, became friends, and they were rivals, and they were lovers, and eventually some of them fell out. And as you say, I began this book thinking that I was going to write just about one of them or two of them, but then insistently, they kept presenting themselves as a group. And I almost felt that you couldn't understand the ways in which the debates about fascism versus communism versus democracy were playing out in the 20s and 30s without having the perspective of real-time arguments that were being had between people who, came from much the same sort of place and then found themselves really at loggerheads about these things. And so, in a way, what I wanted to do was to give you, the reader, the sense of what it's like to actually be in the middle when people don't know how things are going to end up, and your friends are the people with whom you're trying out these ideas.
Mm-hmm. So, Jesselyn, I'm wondering, I have a kind of methodological question for you, which is that you deal with really kind of turmoil and tumult that's in people's lives and in people's families. And I'm curious about how you approached your subjects, how you identified your subjects, and more centrally, how you won over their confidence, their willingness to actually talk to you about some fairly difficult things in their lives and within their families.
Well, I'll just echo, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. And it was actually not as hard to find good characters for this book as I would have thought. I had written about this topic for HuffPost, where I was formerly a journalist, written about children of QAnon believers and what that's like, losing a parent to a different reality. And after that story published, I was just inundated with emails and stories from other people who had been through the same thing. Maybe it was a sister, maybe it was an aunt, a friend. And these people really wanted to tell their stories. They wanted to be heard. And I think when you have someone who is convinced that Hillary Clinton is eating babies and doing all kinds of stuff like that, it's hard to talk about that to your friend when they say, "How are you doing?" It's like, well, not great. My mom is off the deep end. And so they wanted someone who understood what they were going through, and they could speak to about it in a more intimate way. And so my inbox for a long time was almost like a diary for a lot of people. They were sending me like almost essays of what they were going through. And so when I was approached to write this book, I had a lot of potential people I could reach out to see if they wanted to tell their stories at length. And it was almost a hard decision to make who exactly to choose. And in the end, some of the characters in my book were just people who really didn't want to hold anything back. They wanted to share every detail with me. And I've just been so grateful that they've trusted me with their stories.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I'm curious, because you and Jesselyn are both touching on subject matter that deals with parts of the social fracture that we're all dealing with. And, we can kind of talk about it in abstract language like, polarization or asymmetrical polarization, which is what my political science friends refer to it as. But you all are talking about the actual human consequences of this. And so I'm curious about how you saw the sources of these dynamics that you read about. And people have said that this is social media and how much of a role social media plays, and if there are other dynamics that we have to be equally cognizant of.
Well, first, thank you for this great honor. I will mention that my editors at NBC News do have some concerns about the idea that you're going to give out a prize for an unfinished rough draft and how that might affect my future work. They can deal with that later. That's an excellent question. For me, it was very important in this book to lay a foundation up front that makes clear why what we're seeing right now is happening. And part of the answer to that question is, heading into 2020, in the years leading up to that, we were seeing a huge increase during the Trump years in the number of kids reporting that they were being bullied at school, racialized bullying, anti-LGBTQ bullying, anti-immigrant bullying. And these reports were growing in that time. And to call back to Linda's book, a growing understanding of this idea of weathering, that these things don't just suck for kids, it affects their ability to learn in school and has health consequences. And so schools across the country, including in suburbs that used to be majority white or exclusively white, that were in some cases designed for that purpose, that have become much more diverse, were leading the charge in some cases in creating policies to make schools more welcoming and inclusive and to crack down on those things. And so by the time we get to 2020 and the aftermath of George Floyd and what would become the critical race theory panic, we've had years of schools diversifying and making moves to address these real issues. And so the first third of my book is in that space and connecting it to the historical context of what led those spaces to be that way, the history of white supremacy efforts to enforce a very specific worldview in public education dating back to the beginning of public schools in this country. And so, one of the challenges as a daily news reporter is sometimes we get lost in the urgency of now, and a lot of the coverage becomes like, oh, they're panicking at the school board, and I think at NBC we've done a good job of this, and other news outlets have as well. But I wanted to tell the whole picture so that it's not just, wow, these parents are really upset at the school board, something must have changed, and it's this big historical context by the time you get to people yelling at the board meeting.
It's interesting. I mean, that is a kind of structural difficulty of the work that we all do, especially now that the pace of things is so fast, that we're on this, we're on that, and there's so many tumultuous things that happened, so many, just looking at, what happened in Atlanta today, like there's just a kind of ceaseless stream of it, that it gets very difficult to kind of pull back and say, hey, what exactly is going on, and what are the things that tie these different incidents and issues together?
I mean, I will say that, the more newsrooms are giving reporters time and space to step back and do deeper work. I've been very fortunate at NBC News. This book is built off of NBC allowing me to do that type of work, to step back and to look big and broad. But yeah, I mean, that work doesn't necessarily make as much bang for the buck in terms of clicks and advertise, like in terms of page views, than you just got a mom yelling at a school board meeting.
Right.
Right.
But and also, I mean, I think it's like a linear connection to that image of the protester with the flag that he's going to stab the African American man with, that kind of sparked Anthony Lucas's interest in what became Common Ground. So I have a question for all of you, which is slightly unfair for the two people closest to my right, because they're still in the midst of this work, but I'll say thus far along the road. Can you talk about what has been the most difficult part of your project? We start with Linda.
Writing is really difficult. So
I was told that it's easy. It's like,
yeah,
is that not true?
Sure, no, that's not true. Having written is really wonderful. I think that I feel like I wish I had. When I finished, I kept thinking, I wish I had done one more thing. I wish I could have added, for me, it was reproductive justice. So my book came out June 14th, and then the Dobbs decision happened a month later. And then I wish, I'm looking at my editor, we're nodding to each other, but it had to stop, it was already late. And then I got asked a lot of questions about, what does reproductive justice mean for Black women, or the lack of it, or the end of abortion, and what happens in the poorest states to people who have lost their reproductive health choices. And I thought, oh, I wish I had just had a more robust discussion about that in my book. So I think that was the hardest part, was just not, like, feeling so responsible for everything, and then not being able to say every single thing that I wanted to talk about as far as Black health in America.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's always for books, right? It's the foregrounding, backgrounding problem, which is, and I'm looking at my agent, Kathy Robbins, and my editor, Marie Pantogen, who suffered through all of this. For me, I think the difficulty was figuring out how to balance the geopolitical situation, the work that the journalists were actually doing, and then the inner lives and their relationships to each other, and figuring out how to keep those in some kind of dynamic tension. So again, you as the reader felt that you could see the dilemmas as they were working themselves out.
For me, I think the most difficult part has been just feeling like I'm doing these character stories justice. I'm profiling 5 families in my book, and I'm trying to tell their stories from the perspective of the QAnon believer or believers in the family and their loved ones. And so it's been a difficult balance. At times I'll have characters tell me things almost like a therapist that they don't want the other person in the book to know, and so it's kind of just for me and not to make it to print. And so they're trusting me with these very intimate details of their lives, and I do find myself when I'm editing just trying to reread my work through the perspective, if I can think of it through their eyes, through each person that I'm writing about, and trying to make sure I'm being fair, I'm being accurate, I'm not writing in a way that would upset either side of these families. And it's been really difficult to do that, and I'm hopeful that they'll be happy with how it turns out.
I think for me, the biggest challenge will hopefully be something that will benefit us in terms of book sales. But it's so urgent and current and happening and evolving. What I started reporting on was more panic around critical race theory and diversity education, and that has evolved to expand and include anti-LGBTQ sentiment, and now very much entwined with resurgence of Christian nationalism in America, and that's expanding beyond schools. And so for me, the hardest part is landing the plane. My editor's also here, and we're going to be working on that in the coming weeks. But figuring out where the story is not going to end. We're like kind of launching off into what I think will be the next several years of turmoil in this country around schools and the role of education in imparting kindness versus certain political perspectives or biblical views.
Mm-hmm. I will just let you know I'm familiar with that look that both you and Jesselyn keep shooting at your editors. It is I promise you I'm working on it. Look, but I will tell you in solidarity, David Remnick was here yesterday. And so we've known for, I think, 7 weeks that he was going to be here yesterday. And I was like about 2 weeks out scrambling to make sure I had turned in everything I owed the New Yorker before he showed up, because it was going to be very awkward if I was like, so David, I want to interview you. I promise you I'm going to send you that article. But I want to follow up, Jesselyn, about QAnon. And I'm curious about, at this point in your work, if you have a perspective on kind of where this came from and what has allowed it to take root so strongly, not only in the lives of these families, but just generally as the movement itself. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I think one thing I've learned in doing this reporting, I think, is that conspiracy theories are a means to an end for all parties involved. For the people who produce them and disseminate them, often there's a monetary motivation or a political one. And for the people who consume them, maybe it gives them a sense of community or a sense of purpose, or maybe it makes them feel smart to have knowledge that their friends and family members don't. And so how it got to this kind of boiling point it feels like we're at, certainly we've seen it, a lot of right-wing media outlets kind of fanning the flames. We've seen certain political figures. But I think with the pandemic, so many of us experienced loss and heartache and loneliness. And I think for a lot of people, it was just something to hold on to, something kind of consistent in a way. And that's what I've been finding with the families that I've been talking to, is that it's, in a way, it's not even about the information itself. It's not about the actual conspiracy theory. It's about how it makes them feel to believe that, to spout that, to share that. And I guess that's what I think.
So, Deb, I wanted to follow up about the idea of objectivity, which is something that is at the center, really. I should say both of the projects that Mike and Jesselyn are working on are facilitated, to some degree, by the distrust that people have for established media institutions and the kind of alternate realities that people can embrace once they've dismissed, any kind of voice of authority from, national or local media. I wonder how that relates to how your characters saw the world, the dire circumstances they were under. The point that we heard not very long ago, that journalists in America in 2018, 2019, should have a similarly kind of distanced perspective on objectivity. And I wonder how you see that.
So, one of the things that the history of journalism shows you is that the objectivity question is really evergreen, that in a sense, the people who the last call journalists were raised in the big city newsrooms of the 1920s, where objectivity, contra Pulitzer and the world, were actually at the heart of what they were supposed to be doing. As they cast themselves out into the world of Europe and Asia in the 1930s, though, they find that maintaining both sidesism is impossible. And in fact, that itself will do violence to the truth. And so that's become something that for them is at the core of what journalism is. Journalism is not a collection of facts. It's about how the individual reporter, how the journalist actually sees the world and conveying that to the reader. And so in a sense, what they're dealing with in the 20s and 30s is the collapse of the boundary between the world that they're seeing, the world that they're reporting on, and then their own inner lives. And reckoning with that, which is kind of, I think, the dilemma you all are both getting at as well.
You know, it's interesting that you bring up Pulitzer in the world, because, you know, I take great pains to point out, you know, whenever the conversation comes up, that, you know, Joseph Pulitzer, who had very much considered himself above the fray and his world above the fray of the kind of lesser New York publications, was drawn into a circulation war, as many people know, drawn into a circulation war with William Randolph Hearst that ultimately wound up pushing the country into the Spanish-American War. And Pulitzer, in the aftermath of that, was enormously contrite, and his expression of trying to ensure that that never happened again was to create a journalism school. And so we are founded upon the highest aspirations of journalism, but we're also founded on a very sober realization of what happens when journalism goes wrong. And so it's both of those things. So Linda, I want to follow up, you know, with you. Can you say a little bit more about the concept of weathering and how it applies to the people who you are writing about in this book?
Weathering is a concept that was created by Arlene Geronimus, who has a book out about it, came out a couple of weeks ago. And it's the idea that when you are an oppressed or marginalized person, you spend a lot of time fighting for survival. And if you're poor, if you're Black in and of itself, a person of color, LGBTQ, but where Arlene has studied it the most is with Black people who have been oppressed and marginalized the longest in this country. And so what happens is it's a physical response to all that striving just to get a fair shake. And I asked her when I was first interviewing her, explain exactly how that would work. So she said someone would say something to you, maybe it's just a slight insult, they move away from you in the elevator because they think you're gonna mug them, that you are treated badly in a restaurant, or you're treated badly by the police in housing or at your job. And each time that happens, your body has a physical response. So your heart rate goes up. You feel like heat come to your face and your body. Your blood pressure goes up and stress hormones flood your system. So that is good in sometimes, but when it happens to you over and over and over again, it creates a kind of premature aging. And for her, it was showing up in her work in infant mortality. And what she found out was, at the time when she was studying this, it looked like preterm babies and low birth weight babies were the fault of teen girls, because there was this big, conspiracy. I mean, you don't want teen girls to have babies, but it wasn't actually their babies that were dying. It was babies that were from older women who had been weathered. And that's how she first figured it out. And she got very much attacked because it seemed like she was supporting Black teen pregnancy. But it wasn't that. It was just the reality was that it was slightly older women who were having babies born small and early.
So I have a kind of cliche experience in that, I was at LaGuardia Airport last summer, and I was in the queue for taxis And I thought that actually the kind of growth of apps meant that taxi drivers wouldn't behave like this anymore. But the line is going, person gets in a taxi, person gets in a taxi, person gets in a taxi. And then the person who sees that I'm the next person screeches off. Now, I'm immune to this because I've experienced it. But I found myself in an inarticulate rage because I had my 2-year-old twin sons with me. And I was saying I could precisely point to the day and time at which they had first experienced explicit racism. And so, which is knowledge I did not want to have. But you also have to say, like, what do I do with this? I have my sons here. I have to metabolize this in some kind of way and move on. And so, yeah, but that's like weathering. I understand that term, I think. So I want to say we have a little bit of time for questions from the audience, which we'll get to in a second. I'm aware that we have Robert and Tolu with us. I wonder if there's anything about this conversation that resonates with you, anything that you want to weigh in with. There's a microphone here, about the journey with your project, how the book has been received, and so on.
Tolu's handing it to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's on.
Are we on? Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Robert. This is Tolu. Tolu gave me the microphone. I think there are a few things that really resonate in terms of our work. Linda and I have been on panels before. Our work concentrates on looking at the life of George Floyd and how systemic racism shaped his life, including the fact that dealing with his personhood and being misunderstood for such a long time on his life appeared to present itself in him physically. You saw things like early heart disease, high blood pressure, bad knees, bad back, that not only affected the way he felt about himself, but were a part of the reasons he started to use opioids, which led to another problem. And I think sort of making those connections, I think the through line in all of these books and what we did is trying to make these sort of very ethereal, sometimes academic ideas seem very real. And through the life of George Floyd is how we did it. Also understanding and recognizing that it was important that even though Tolu and I come from a newspaper background, that we take a perspective and we don't try to equivocate about what we learned about how racism operates in this country. And we think in the presentation of those facts coupled with research and narrative helped to propel the narrative to be what it was.
Mm.
And I'll just add to that to say that we wrote the story of George Floyd's life as an American story. We wanted it to be a story that tells us about America, tells us about a part of America that we don't always get to see. And reporters don't always go to Houston's 3rd Ward or to the cotton fields and tobacco fields of North Carolina where George Floyd's ancestors worked to see how an American family traversed the trauma of racism over the course of various generations. And I think a lot of what we've heard this evening intersects with what we found with George Floyd's life. We went to his schools, we talked to his teachers, we saw how the battle over desegregation took place in Houston and how much backlash there was, to the point that even as judges said that Houston needed to desegregate and needed to put white teachers into black schools and bus students from their homes into other schools, there was so much of a backlash that students and parents took their kids out of school rather than having their students learn alongside black children. And so George Floyd ended up going to segregated schools all of his life, underfunded schools, and he was deprived of the opportunity to have an equal education. And we saw how that played out in his life over the course of his life. We also saw, as Robert said, how the healthcare system was prejudiced against people like George Floyd, and how he experienced life as a big black man, and how all of the challenges and stereotypes that were put upon him made it difficult for him to get the benefit of the doubt, and for him to be able to live his truth as someone who would go around saying "I love you" to everyone, because he saw himself as a loving, kind person, but people saw him as an intimidating force, and how difficult it was for him to move through the world. And so there's a lot of resonance in what we've heard this evening that touches on what we found when we were writing George Floyd's story, and it's why we wanted to write his story as an American story, because it touches on so many parts of our institutions and so many different pieces of who we are as a country. But it's rare that we get to see that from George Floyd's perspective, or from the perspective of someone like George Floyd. And so we were honored by the opportunity to be able to tell his story.
I have a practical question for you, which is that in college I had a really good friend, we were great friends, interested in the same books, hung out in the same crowd, and then we lived together for a summer. So did you two get along together better before you did the book together, or after you did the book together?
I think we should both answer this question, probably. It's like the newlywed game, see if we answer the same way. So I've known Robert for about 15 years. We've kind of moved around journalism circles together, and we worked at the Post together, but we actually had never really worked on any major projects together over the course of that time. So this was the first time we had an opportunity to do that. And we were writing during the pandemic, and because of our tough deadline, we kind of needed to be in different places for most of the reporting. And so maybe that had something to do with it. We didn't live together. We weren't physically together for most of the time, but we spent a lot of time on Zooms, a lot of time on text chains and on phone calls. And we found that we got closer as we were writing this story. We have this unique experience being black men in journalism, being able to tell this story. It's an incredibly unique experience, and we knew that we brought something to the table that was rare, and I think we were able to connect on a deeper level because of that. And I think that helped to smooth over some of the few times where we had disagreements, where usually I was right, but we were able to work through those few disagreements, and for the most part, it was really an honor to be able to go through this journey together and talk about some of these issues. We spent a lot of time just talking, and really talking about things that we don't often get a chance to talk about on a very deep and honest level in newsrooms, where sometimes we're the only one who has that experience, or who has that context. And so it was refreshing to be able to talk through some of these subjects that we ended up writing about, and we found it very enjoyable, even though writing, as Linda said, is very difficult. It's much nicer to have written, but it was helpful to be able to have someone to go through the journey alongside us.
You sound vaguely like the couple that says communication is key. So we have time for a few questions from the panel. Anyone who has seen anything I've done before knows what comes next. I will say this: it doesn't apply to you. It applies to the person next to you. A question is an interrogative sentence, generally noted by the inflection at the end of it, as contrasted by a statement which offers information. A question requests information. We would like questions, and we would like questions that are phrased as succinctly as possible, so we can get to as many of them as possible.
Oh.
With that disclaimer, there's a
We're
microphone
lining up
there.
here.
Yeah, there's a microphone where Abby
Join
is.
us. Hi, everyone. Congratulations to all of you. I am a huge fan of all of your work. My name is Abby Wright. I work here. Shout out to my boss, Jelani. Two-part question, but it's going to be brief. Everyone, please share a pro tip, something you've learned about your craft that would be helpful to someone else trying to write a book right now, like a hack or a tip. And Jesselyn, after all your research, this sounds like a joke question, but I kind of wonder, after all the stories that you've heard, who is Q? Two-parter, thank you.
Is Q in this room?
That's the end. You gotta buy the book.
Well, there's a strong belief that Q is a number of people, but primarily a man who was living in the Philippines, who was running 8kun and 8chan for a while and actually had child pornography on that site. So a little bit of an irony there for someone running an anti-porn organization, but I guess the jury's still out on that one. We don't know for certain. And my pro tip, I think waking up early is a good one. I have a 10-month-old son, so that has been kind of part of my routine lately, and getting up at the crack of dawn and feeding him and then sitting down to write has been actually really helpful in getting this book done.
I think my pro tip is taking breaks. And what that was really, I get up really early too, maybe not quite as early as you. And then write and think and report and then take a break and then go back to it. And then everybody in my life knows I'm not an evening person. So by 6:30, I'm completely done. So you could be talking to me about, I don't care. Talk to me again tomorrow morning. And so I'm disciplined about taking care of myself.
I mean, I feel like people who have written a book should go ahead first, actually.
I will happily go. So mine is actually a historian point, which is I try to figure out how I can know as much as I can about the world so that I can close my eyes and just imagine it. And that makes a huge difference to me. Like, what perfume were they wearing? And then I kind of try to figure it out.
I mean, I guess my tip would be for journalists at daily news organizations who want to write a book. I mean, for me, having a job where I was allowed to just become obsessive, and so, but finding that thing that when you're on a good story, I guess, and you know that it's more than just one off, and you're going to pivot to the next thing. Fight or argue with your bosses to keep going, because there might be more. And that's kind of how this book was like a news article, a singular news article that we published in 2021 that we were like, well, there might be more here. And I kind of pushed to create a project off of it that I should mention that I co-reported with NBC News correspondent named Antonia Hilton, who is her name's not on the book, but she has contributed quite a bit, and wouldn't be possible without our partnership. But we did that project, and then we kept going, and we've kept going and kept going. I'm looking at my editors, but the story wasn't a one-off, and we saw something bigger, and we kept pushing. And I've specializing in that, and that's what's given me the rope, I guess, to piece this all together in a bigger contextual way.
Hi, I'm Andrea Bernstein. I'm a big fan of everybody on the stage. My question is for Mike and Jess. Can you please talk, and this is an issue that I've also really grappled with, how are you deciding to end your books in a story that just will not end?
Oh, I mean, can we talk in about 1 month? We can discuss that. Really, I think, the story's not ending, but I think we can see where it's going. And so I think it's okay. By the time this book comes out in a year, fingers crossed and Lord willing, I think that we will be watching Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump battling each other to determine who is the greatest school culture warrior, who's going to be implementing the most regressive policies against transgender children in public schools. And so we know that. We can see that's coming. And so I think not trying to predict the future with the ending, but to try to land it in a way that gives you a sense of, how this has shaped and changed the lives of real people who are, in my book, at the core of this, talking about like the real impact of these big political issues. And so hopefully it'll resonate, whatever it is. Yeah.
I've been just trying to follow the stories of my characters who are in this book, the 5 families, and it has been tempting to try to end this book on a positive note. Obviously, this problem is going to go on for a long, long time, and there's not much positive to say about it right now. But I'm trying to end it in a really honest way. It's not with a nice little bow at the end. It's not rainbows and smiles, but it's the character who I begin the book with. We kind of have a full circle moment, and it just feels like a good place to put a rest to it.
Hi, I'm Sharon Marcus. I'm a professor in the English department here at Columbia, and I am curious what all of you see as the advantages and limitations of the book form, specifically because we're at a journalism school where things are usually shorter. You know, the typical form of journalism is short and, in every sense of the word, short term, short form.
I mean, I think I hit on this earlier where, you know, with a daily news article, you can't tell the whole story. You just can't tell the big picture, historical context. You can do that in some longer features. The other thing that's interesting for me is this is a book that was derived from a podcast initially, and so it's audio to print. And I mean, it's been a challenge actually to go from. We were just discussing this with one of the judges earlier. The idea that like with an audio story, you don't have to describe the tone in the room because you just hear it on the tape. And so finding ways of doing that in print and writing is to me much harder. So yeah, it's a challenge.
I think I'll just say the positive actually of the book form because that's my native form, but there's an elasticity about what a book can be, and there's a pleasure in that too. So I remember thinking, how am I going to end this book? And I decided to end it with a moment when the last surviving journalist of this group has a parade of biographers coming, and he really is a reluctant subject. He does not want to talk about his friends. He thinks no one can possibly understand it, what they have all seen and gone through. And then I realized, well, I was just cutting out 40 years of their lives to jump right to that moment. And that is something you can just do in a book because of that sort of accordion-like nature. So
I write really long magazine articles. And what I was finding, before I started writing the book, was people were calling or emailing and saying, do you mind if I Xerox your magazine article on maternal and infant mortality or HIV/AIDS or whatever it was? And also, do you mind if I Xerox 2 of them and put them together? And then I'm thinking, wait, if people are desperately feeling bad, is this a copyright issue? I was like, no, you can do it as much as you want. Then I realized people want this more comprehensive, using history, using, sort of like what's happening in the present, what happened in the past, who's to blame, how did this happen in a big, overall, broad and deep way. And I thought, oh, that's what I need to do. I'm the one who should be doing this because there's a demand for it, especially for me and from medical students and people in health and healthcare.
I would say I was really excited to write a book because as a journalist, when I would write articles, I would always turn in my first draft to my editors, and they would just say, cut it in half. This is way too long. And so I was excited to have a really long-form project, and I ended up kind of running into the same issue. Chapters that were supposed to be 5,000 words ended up being 8,000. So I've still been having to shave down a lot of my writing because I just get so excited when I get into some of these topics that I can go so deep. But I have really loved that you can really get into the complexities of your characters, of the people, of the little details about them. It's been so nice to be able to have the space and the freedom to do that. I was just talking with some editors earlier today about the challenge of writing for news organizations sometimes is that going through the standards and legal process, sometimes your writing has to be so technical, so careful, so perfectly attributed, and it kind of takes the flair out of it. And so while I was working at NBC and trying to write this book, I was kind of getting pulled in different directions from my editors. My book editor, Kevin, would always tell me to kind of loosen up, have a little more personality in your writing. And then at NBC, it was, be a little more cautious with how you say that. So it's been nice to have a little more freedom with the book.
And you get the last question of the night.
Oh boy, I'm honored. Okay, so sadly, it's probably a very complex question, but so in identifying, my name is Cindy Bongard, by the way, so in identifying solutions or novel solutions at a foundational level, I'm wondering, are there any common threads identifiable in the purporting communities that might emerge? So we've got all these problems identified. Are there, in your research, might you have encountered any novel solutions that might present a commonality among your investigations?
I have what's going to sound like a flippant answer, but it really isn't. One of them is drink more old fashions, right? That's definitely what the reporters in my book would say. But then they would also say something else, which is the war for public opinion is not lost, and it matters to keep on fighting for that. And that even when you think it's slipping away, it turns around quite quickly in unpredictable fashion.
I think part of my reporting was seeing what people were doing wrong and looking at it saying, oh, this solution is not the right one. And in Black health outcomes, it was all Black people are poor, and if we just lift that boat, then and that wasn't true. And then it was, if there's just everyone has access to health care, then Black health outcomes will improve. And that wasn't true. And that didn't work, and it hadn't worked, but people were, people who made decisions, gave money, gave funding, were using those false premises. So what I tried to do was say, there are actually simpler solutions to some of these problems, and some of them are people-centric, some of them aren't even that expensive. They are used in much poorer countries than ours to great success. The other thing that I love talking about solutions, and one of them was encouraging medical students, because many medical students were politicized in high school and in undergraduate college. And so now they're much more political than previous and much more interested in social justice and being different kinds of doctors. So I found that really exciting and was something I really tried to lift up. And as I've been going, to talk about the book in medical schools, it's been thrilling to see how happy they are to have the book, to talk about the issues, and to be able to even push back against their own faculty and administration.
I mean, the problems at the center of our books is like the fracturing that's at the main problem in our country today. So the solution is, I don't know. I think the solution probably is extremely simple, but unlikely. The more people communicate with real people, with their neighbors, and the less that they believe, scary political mailers that show up at their house, they'll be more likely to make informed decisions about what's actually happening in their schools. But I don't think my book, I don't know that it presents a solution. It reveals the problem, and it's connected to much bigger issues than these local communities. So it's hard to say what the fix is.
Yeah, I'll agree with you. Don't have the solution to QAnon, but I would say that
spoiler.
I think it's tough in journalism. You were talking about this earlier, Mike, but just trying to get past the noise, get past the headline of the day. There's been a lot of reporting about conspiracy theories about, the people who believe them must be crazy, or they must be horrible, or mentally ill. And I think kind of taking the time to really look at, like, what are the unmet human needs here? Why do conspiracy theories appeal to this person? What are they fulfilling for them? What is the reason that they're latching onto these so strongly, and kind of looking at a more societal level, some of the problems that have made people vulnerable to this. Sometimes they are just racist, and sometimes they are just wanting to be sensational, but sometimes there's something much deeper going on, and that's what I found in really getting to know the people I've been reporting on for this book. And so our normal way of reporting, when we are trying to meet deadlines and we are trying to keep up with the news cycle, doesn't give us the flexibility to really dive into what is going on here and why is this spreading as rapidly as it is. And so I think just maybe slowing down and trying to better understand the root of the problem, not a solution, but at least a step in the right direction.
I will propose one solution. I'm not a panelist, but I think as a final word here, in 2016, 2017, I, for completely separate reasons, had been engaging with and interacting with a number of international conflict resolution specialists. And these were people who'd worked in Rwanda, in South Africa after apartheid, in Northern Ireland in the midst of the Troubles, and kind of an array of places where there had been, serious societal fracture and conflict. And what came up in the midst of distinct conversations was their discomfort with how many of the dynamics that they saw in these other places that were emerging in the United States. And so, like anyone else, the first impulse was to ask, then what do we do? And person after person said, it begins with the willingness to talk. And they said, this sounds very oversimplified, but we have managed conversations between families and people who have killed their family members, people who have done all manner of horrible things, and we found ways to facilitate dialogue, which didn't mean that there was total forgiveness, but it meant that there was a starting place. And so in that regard, as people who craft narratives, as people who give voice to people who might not otherwise have a voice that very many people can hear, and as journalists, as writers, as people who communicate in one way, shape, or form, our work could never have been more important than it is at this moment. So thank you and congratulations to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out. And I think we still have like food and stuff in the back there, so enjoy.
That was great, thank you.
Good luck.
Yes, thank you so much.
Some magazines, kind of like the same kind of thing in books. And then my paperback is coming out next week.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I have more.
Robert, everybody.
Team. Which is which? Congratulations.
Yeah. Charles, that means pride to float away. Yeah.
my son, my book was actually supposed to be done already, but my husband and I got him to Canada for our baby shower, and our son was born 2.5 months early while we were up there. So we got stuck there for months in a NICU, and yeah, by the time I got back down, I think it was like 6 months operating. But no, it was teeny tiny, but now he's doing much better. My husband's saying we were reading.
I was teaching a class and I couldn't hear, so I'm crashing.
Get your book.
I don't think so. You're amazing.
It's like, I'm pretty sure.
No, you are. I don't know how you do that you do with him. It's like really.
Yeah.
Anyway, you're amazing. I'm proud of you.
I mean, it just feels like kind of a book leave, so I'm furiously trying to finish that. I'm still behind, but yeah, catching up. Congratulations on your final kind of wrap-ups here.
Oh,
I mean, that's incredible ending. Gosh. Yeah. I didn't know you were teaching.
I'm not. I was teaching for a friend.
Oh, okay.
Like Southern English.
My mom sent me this is Brandy. I've told you about her reporting where she's at
Thank
NBC.
you. She's amazing, as you know.
Well, you know, she's my kid.
Yeah.
We're going to head out soon. Do you want me to take all this? I've got all your stuff.
Yes, please. And you, well, before you go, let me call. My friend is babysitting my baby over on the east side.
Understand there have been no SOS, babies crying. Kyle said there were no.
Never left them with someone before, so I'm glad to hear that.
Take those, though, for emergency energy. And dessert. You always have to get a chance. Anyway, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Okay,
Take care.
Have fun.